Elon Musk rocket about to crash into the moon. The first thing I thought of was the moon with an X on it, like a bullseye.
I read this study about something they call
put your love in the hand now, baby. I'm begging you. Put your love in the hand now, darling.
So that's what's going on. Everything is going just as planned. I knew the Supreme Court would knock it down as unconstitutional, the mandates. There's just no chance in hell that they were going to let that slip by. But don't worry, there'll be another way. They'll find another way. That was meant to be a little bit funny. They'll find another way.
It'll do wonders for you. As the first slide suggests, we're going to talk about Genesis and other creation accounts. Now, when I say other creation accounts, I, of course, mean other creation accounts that existed and were put forth by other civilizations in the ancient world, Israel's neighbors, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, Babylonians, that sort of thing. But whether you realize it or not, there are actually creation account passages in the Old Testament that do not sound like Genesis 1.
There we go. Can you talk about some of the similarities between Norse and Finno-Ugric mythologies? Yeah, that's very nice. Finno-Ugric. I can't pretend to be an expert on Finno-Ugric mythologies. I've just read a bit.
In Mesopotamia, you have in their conception, at the beginning there was just water. All right? And the water itself, this watery, it's just water, the watery abyss it's often referred to, has two sides. It has a male and a female. Again, they're thinking everything came from this watery place.
I read this study about something they call Proto-Uralic mythology. By Proto-Uralic, it's a way of reconstructing original mythology from folklore and old texts. So someone, I think his last name was Napolskik or something, Napolskik, yeah. He wrote a really interesting article that was very helpful. He wrote this article about what was similar, because if you look at, he was looking through all these Finno-Ugric myths, all of them, I mean from the Sami, from the Finnish, and all these diverse Siberian tribes who were Uralic, Finno-Ugric, and he saw that there was something that happened in all of them, because they're all different, they all belong to cultures that have been separated from each other for a long time, ages and ages and ages. So when they all share some traits in common, we can reasonably assume that these traits are very old. So that's what is called. That's why it's called Proto-Uralic, like Proto-Indo-European. We have. So, like, for example, if you go to look at all these Indo-European mythologies, you find some similarities that are repeated in all of them. That's when we can think that this is very ancient. Like Thor mythology has a lot in common with Indra mythology from the Vedas. And the connection between Norse mythology and the Indian Vedas is very old. It goes back at least 5,000 years. So... and it's also repeated, the symbols, the hammer symbol, a lot of Thor symbolism, thunder god symbolism is repeated in many Indo-European mythologies, which means that it is extremely ancient.
Now you'll recall from our talk last week that we said Genesis can be read in such a way that you have pre-existing material that God returns to or gets around to ordering, And that can be, the way we understand Genesis. And if you remember from last week, the first creative act then would be in verse 3. In the Hebrew Bible, you will find a number of places where Yahweh, the God of Israel, is described in Baal terminology. Why do they do that? Because the biblical writer wants it to be clear to his readers that, no, it isn't Baal who did this or that great thing. It isn't some other, god that the foreigners worship. El was their other big deity. It's Yahweh. And so the writers are very familiar with their literature, and they'll take phrases and episodes and vocabulary out of the pagan literature, import it into what they're writing in the Hebrew Bible, and literally change the names. And they will give the God of Israel credit. It's a theological technique. It's a polemic. We use the word polemic. If we could pretend to ourselves, if we didn't have a Bible, try to pretend we don't have a Bible, and we're sitting here and we don't like the powers that be, the authority figures, whether they be religious or political, and somehow we're sure that God is leading us to produce our own record, our own theological correction of what we should believe. One of the things we might do is we might hear a claim of some other deity or some authority figure taking credit for something. I'm responsible for, the crops that grow. And if people were familiar with that, we could say, okay, I'm going to take a shot at that. While I'm writing my history of who the true God really is, I'm going to take that claim, bring it in here, and I'm going to set the record straight. Biblical writers did that all the time. It's theological messaging. Now, I have an arrow here for the wilderness, pointing at the wilderness. Does that sound incongruous? Well, if it's the sea, how do you get the wilderness in the sea? Anybody notice that? The wilderness thing? It's because, let me just ask in the form of a question. Was there anything else that had to do with water that God acted upon that was perceived as an act of creation that wasn't the original creation? God, water. What was that? Come on. He said, what other place does water get split? The Red Sea. If we look at Psalm 89, see if my link will work here. Psalm 89 is really, again, a fascinating example here, if I can get it to open. There we go. Let's just read through parts of Psalm 89. I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. In my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. Again, this is a scene in heaven, God surrounded by the heavenly host. Again, divine council terminology. You've heard me use that term before. It's just God in the heavenly host. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Lord in all caps is Yahweh. Of old you spoke in a vision to your godly one and said, I have granted help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him. So that my hand shall be established with him. My arm shall also strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked will not humble him. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and my steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. It's repeating a lot of the language that we've seen before. And then he says about David, I will set his hand on the sea. I will put his hand, Okay, the right hand of authority, okay, over the sea. This is very obviously messianic because only God can do that. Only God can control the forces of chaos. David can't do that. He's just a guy. Okay, but a Davidic king who is also Yahweh can pull that off. Okay, I will set his hand on the sea, at his right hand on the Nahar. Remember the other name in the Ugaritic text for the deity, the water deity, Nahar? His right hand on the rivers. He shall cry to me, you are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation. I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. You know what the word highest there is? Let's see if we can just click through to our interlinear and actually use that thing. It's Elyon, most high. Elyon in the Semitic world was a title for guess who? Baal. It's one of the titles of Baal that gets applied to Yahweh. God is saying, not only am I the real Most High, but the king, I will set his hand over the seas. He will be the Most High. I will make him the firstborn. Is that a familiar term? Think about it, to an Israelite. These guys have their Old Testament. They've got the worldview in their brains. They know the stories. They're Semites. They're Israelites. This guy Jesus comes along and he claims to be the Son of God. Son of God, King of Israel. Man, it sounds a lot like Psalm 89. Ooh, boy, that's kind of weird. And he comes to them one day, or one night. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to their side. Leaving the boat, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And we know the whole story. They're clicking. They're just clicking with these little tidbits in the text. This isn't a story placed in here just because Mark's like, man, I'm a few lines short of a column. What do I put in here? No, it's deliberate. It's messaging. We go back. We get Matthew 14. It's, again, somewhat similar. It's walking on the water. The chaos has no effect on me. In fact, I tread on it. Again, mentally up here, the pieces are just floating around in their head. And Jesus will do things, or he'll say things. After 3.5 years of this, it's no wonder that he looks at him and says, haven't I been with you 3.5 years and you don't get this yet? How could you miss this? We have a few minutes, we'll hit Egypt a little bit. Now, my font. See, we didn't check the font, Dax. In Egypt, the watery abyss, if you can't read that, it says Heliopolitan theology. Egyptian creation theology and Egyptian religion generally changed depending on what city was the capital city, because where the pharaoh wants to live, he sort of gets to decide what the doctrine is. But generally, one of the main versions of this is called the Heliopolitan theology. So you have the same idea, except in Egypt, they're not really thinking of the primeval deities as specific elements like water and dirt and all that stuff. They think of them as conditions, what it was like when there was nothing or before there was everything. And so they take some of the terminology for conditions to be represented by deities.
And in the Proto-Uralic study, what stood out as common for all of them, and thus very ancient and widespread, and it was the idea that there is a land to the south of the world It could be called the Sunland or the Winterland or the Summerland. And here a woman lived by a lake, and if you bathe in this lake was full of geese and waterbirds. These geese and waterbirds, we know for a fact that all these that these shamanic cultures that we have had access to even in modern times, they believe that the souls of dead human beings or the souls of people who were traveling outside their bodies would take the form of a waterbird, and they could go to this lake where there is a sun woman, and they could dive into the lake, and they would come out renewed and could be reborn. And there was a tree by this lake. Now I'm trying to remember because I haven't. Yeah. Anyway, this is very, very, very similar to the description in Snorri and in the Poetic Edda as well, of the Norse who live by a lake, by a tree, and this lake has the ability. This lake has waterbirds in it, and if you bathe in this lake, you will be renewed and reborn. So this is, and it's also situated in the south. So there have definitely been, must have been some mutual sharing here that probably goes very far back in time. I'm sure there are a lot more similarities to Finno-Ugric myths and Norse myths, but obviously there are similarities between almost all the mythologies of the world. And for example, just the world tree, that's universal. You find it everywhere. You find it even in the Americas.
Norden, Sudri, Austri, Vestri, alt for dvaler, nar og nar, nibinger, daler, bifer, bafer, bomber, nori, and og anar, oin, medviten, vegger og gandal, vindal for thorin, trar og drain, trekker, liter og vitere, nyr og nyråder. Norden, Sudri, Austri, Vestri, alt for dvaler, nar og nar, nibinger, daler, bifer, bafer, bomber, nori, and og anar, oin, medviten, vegger og gandal, vindal for thorin, trar og drain, trekker, liter og vitere, nyr og nyråder. Norden, Sudri, Austri, Vestri, alt for dvaler, nar og nar, nibinger, daler, bifer, bafer, bomber, nori. Norden, Sudri, Austri, Vestri, alt for dvaler, nar og nar, nibinger, daler, bifer, bafer, bomber, nori. And og anar, oin, medviten, vegger og gandal, vindal for thorin, trar og drain, trekker, liter og vitere, nyr og nyråder. Fili, kili, fundi, nali, hepti, vili, hanar, sviur, billinger, bruni, bilder og buri, frar, hornbori, fräger og loni, aurvanger, jali og eiken, sjaldi.
Then guess who you are. And if you be Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed. Who's Abraham's seed? Abraham's seed is Christ. If you've been baptized into Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. Who is Abraham's seed? Abraham's seed is Christ. You are children of God, and if you're baptized into Christ, you're Abraham's seed, and Abraham's seed is Christ. I hope this is sticking in. And you are heirs according to the promise. Now listen to this, because this is why a lot of you think that you're like a meatball like me. Now I say that the heir, as long as they are a child, means immature, they differ nothing from a slave or a servant, even though they are Lord of everything. God gave us this world. God gave us dominion. Christ died for you.